On the morning of July 26, 1943, before the world knew his name, John woke in the cold English dawn with frost on the tent canvas above him and a tension in the air no man could ignore. Somewhere in the distance, engines were already warming up, each one coughing awake like a creature dragged unwillingly from sleep. The airfield at Thurley smelled of fuel, oil, damp wool, and the nervous sweat of men preparing to challenge the sky again. Men who knew well that every mission could be their last. John dressed in near silence, listening to the familiar rhythms, the clank of tools, the dull thud of bomb loaders at work, the clipped voices of ground crews calling out checks. Every man carried the same question inside him. Would today be the day the sky took him? His crew of the B-17 Ruthie II met him on the hard-packed ground beside the bomber. Some joked to hide the fear. Some smoked. Some stared at nothing. John simply touched the steel skin of the aircraft, cold as a gravestone, and hoped it would be enough. The mission brief was simple on paper: cross the channel, push deep into Germany, and hit the industrial heart of Hanover. But every flyer knew nothing about a mission over Germany was simple. Not with flak cannons waiting, not with swarms of fighters hungering for the kill, not with the sky turning into a furnace the moment a formation broke. By 8 a.m., Ruthie II was airborne, part of a massive formation glinting silver in the rising sun. The cold bit through gloves and jackets. Oxygen hissed through masks. Frost crept along windows. Yet below them, the world looked peaceful. Green fields, winding rivers, small towns that had no idea of the violence roaring above. An hour into enemy territory, the first black blossoms of flak burst around them. The plane shuddered. Metal rang like bells struck by invisible hammers. Then came the fighters, Messerschmitts diving like steel falcons. The sky turned into chaos. Rattling guns, sparks, smoke, screams over the intercom. Something slammed into the cockpit. John turned and saw the co-pilot's side explode into red mist. His pilot slumped forward, barely conscious, blood running across the controls. Then came that sound again. The whistling. The thin, deadly whistle of air slicing through a bomber that was no longer whole. Engines dying, flaps gone, landing gear shredded, a wounded man pinned against the wheel. 30,000 pounds of steel falling out of the sky, and John Morgan, alone, freezing, bleeding, grabbed the controls with one hand and refused to let the bomber die. Because sometimes history doesn't wait for heroes. Sometimes it creates them in a single, impossible moment. John stepped out into the gray light, adjusting his sheepskin jacket, his breath spiraling upward in ghostly clouds. Ground crews hurried around him, loading ammunition, checking control surfaces, patching holes from yesterday's mission. The 8th Air Force fought a brutal war of attrition. Planes landed shredded, limping home on torn wings and prayer alone. But not all limped home. Some never returned. John stared across the field at the bomber assigned to him that day, a B-17 Flying Fortress, proud, towering silver where the paint had chipped, its nose art of a diving falcon half faded by weather and flak. The bomber looked solid, indestructible, even though every man there knew it wasn't. No aircraft in the world could withstand the punishment these missions demanded, but the men still named them, touched them like lucky talismans, trusted them with everything they had. Today their mission was deep inside Germany. Schweinfurt, the heart of the enemy's ball-bearing industry, a target so heavily defended that men joked grimly you could walk across the sky on German flak alone. John climbed into the cockpit, inhaling the familiar smell: metal, leather, cold oxygen, the faint tang of gun oil. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Bill Rendell, greeted him with a half grin, though the shadows under his eyes told a different story. Nobody slept well before Schweinfurt. The crew settled into their positions: navigator, bombardier, radio operator, and the gunners. Young men, most barely 20, men who had been farmers, teachers, mechanics, college students, men who now flew into anti-aircraft storms that ripped the air into jagged pieces. The engines roared to life, four synchronized thunderclaps shaking the ground. The bomber taxied, joined by dozens of others forming tight formations, triangles of steel and firepower glistening under the rising sun. The sight was magnificent. It was also terrifying, because every man there knew the truth. Over Germany, the bombers would fly into hell, and hell would be waiting. The formation climbed higher and higher until the English countryside disappeared beneath blankets of cloud. Frost crept along the inside of the cockpit windows. Oxygen masks hissed with each breath. Outside, the sky darkened, turning from blue to steel. This far up, the air no longer felt like part of the world below. Hours passed, the radio filled with updates, corrections, warnings. German radar had spotted them. Fighters were lifting. The Luftwaffe was converging. Then, just past the border of Germany, the first black blooms of flak burst around the formation. The sky lit with thunder. The bomber shuddered violently as explosions rocked the air. The metal skin rang like a drum. Shrapnel tore holes in wings, the fuselage, even the cockpit floor. The sound was horrific. Steel screaming as it bent, rivets snapping, oxygen lines hissing under sudden pressure loss. But John held the bomber steady. He had done this before. He knew the rhythm of flak bursts, the way the sky seemed to tremble before the next explosion. Then the fighters came. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs dropped from the sun like predators, their cannons spitting fire. Tracer rounds streaked past the cockpit. The bombers tightened formation, forcing discipline through instinct and training. A B-17 was strong, but its strength came from unity, like phalanxes of old holding shields side by side. John saw a bomber ahead take a hit to the wing root. It rolled, broke apart, and vanished in a silent fireball. No parachutes. Another spun downward, trailing smoke, engines ablaze. His jaw tightened. He kept flying. The German fighters made another pass. This one hit home. A cannon shell smashed through the cockpit, exploding between John and Rendell. The blast sent glass shards slicing through uniforms and skin. For a moment, John's vision blurred. His ears rang. The wind howled through the torn-open cockpit window, freezing everything it touched. When his vision cleared, he saw the nightmare. The co-pilot, Rendell, was slumped in his seat, mask torn off. He wasn't dead, but the blast had crushed part of his skull. His eyes flickered, unfocused, one side of his face slack. Blood dripped onto the controls. His body spasmed violently, like he was fighting some invisible enemy. Then Rendell's hands clamped onto the control wheel, and he pulled. Not in panic, not in intention, but in the blind convulsions of a man whose brain no longer obeyed him. The bomber jerked into a right roll, nearly flipping. The crew in the back screamed over the intercom as they were thrown sideways. John grabbed the control column, wrestling against Rendell's iron grip. Frostbitten wind whipped into his mask, cracking his lips, chilling his skin until it burned. The plane was diving, fast, losing altitude, the formation drifting away above them. John shouted for help, but the intercom had been destroyed. Only static. Rendell convulsed again, pulling harder, sending the aircraft into a sharper spiral that pushed John against his harness. Every muscle in his arms strained. His fingers dug into the wheel. He tried to shove Rendell's hands off, but the man's dying grip was impossibly strong. One man, injured and delirious, had the strength of three. The bomber continued spiraling downward, sunlight flashing across its wings like a strobe. German fighters roared past, firing, not realizing the plane was already on the verge of crashing. John knew that in seconds they would break apart. He had to regain control, had to save the crew, had to do the impossible. He did not think. He acted. He reached across with his elbow, pinning Rendell's arm as best as he could. Using his other hand, he shoved the control wheel with all his weight, fighting not just gravity and wind, but the convulsions of a man dying next to him. The bomber groaned, metal creaking, wings vibrating in warning. The altimeter spun downward. The horizon jolted wildly. Then, slowly, painfully, the plane leveled. Barely. They were thousands of feet below formation, drifting alone into German airspace. Fighters circled like sharks, sensing wounded prey. The crew behind John had no idea what was happening, only that their fortress was bleeding, losing altitude, and terrifyingly silent except for the wind ripping through the cockpit. John tried again to pry Rendell's hands off, but each attempt failed. The co-pilot's body convulsed with the randomness of a struck nerve. His boots kicked the floor, his head jerked, his fingers tightened on the controls as though welded there. John realized the truth with a cold finality. If he let go of the controls, even for a moment, the bomber would flip, dive, and kill everyone on board. He would have to fly the plane with one hand, for hours, under attack, in a crippled bomber. Behind him, the nightmare worsened. The first engine caught fire, then the second. Flames blew back along the wing edge, licking at the fuselage. Smoke choked the waist gunners. Oxygen was leaking, fuel streaming, hydraulics fading. The fortress was dying. John held the control wheel in a death grip as the burning bomber drifted deeper into Germany, encircled by fighters that seemed unsure whether it was already doomed. They made hesitant passes, but the gunners in back fired back with furious determination, chasing them off again and again. The radio man tried to send a distress call. Nothing. The bombardier checked the bombs. They could not drop. The doors were jammed. The waist gunners reported flames spreading inside the wing. The tail gunner shouted warning after warning as fighters regrouped. And all the while, John held the controls alone, wrestling a 30-ton burning aircraft with one arm while the other fought the involuntary death throes of the man beside him. Minutes felt like hours. Hours like eternity. The bomber limped toward the Dutch coast. The fighters peeled away, out of fuel. Flak batteries opened up instead, filling the sky with black bursts. Shrapnel shredded what the fighters had missed. The third engine died. The fortress sank lower and lower, shaking violently, pieces falling from the wings. Still, John did not let go. When they finally crossed the North Sea, the crew realized they might survive if they could reach England. But reaching England was no guarantee. The landing gear was destroyed. The flaps were gone. 3 engines were dead. 1 was barely alive. Fuel was almost gone, and their pilot could not release the controls for even a second. John pressed the radio button with his elbow, trying to call base. Static. He was too low, too damaged, too far from home. He guided the bomber lower, searching for a patch of coastline, anything where he could attempt a landing. Behind him, the crew braced for impact, knowing the odds of surviving a wheels-up landing in a burning, uncontrollable B-17 were nearly zero. The last engine sputtered, coughed, died. Silence. The bomber was now a falling brick, gliding only on luck and whatever lift remained in its shredded wings. John could feel the controls go soft, the weight shifting, gravity pulling. He angled the nose upward slightly, fighting the stall. His arms screamed in pain. His fingers were numb. His shoulders trembled violently. The ground rose fast, too fast. He picked a field. There was no time for anything else. The bomber skimmed the tops of trees, clipping branches, tearing a path through the leaves. Sparks flew from the wingtips. Smoke swallowed the fuselage. John held the controls with every ounce of strength he had left. The impact hit like a freight train. Metal crunched. Wings tore. The fuselage skipped, bounced, then skidded across the field, gouging deep scars in the earth. Flames exploded from under the wings. Equipment flew like shrapnel inside the cabin. Men were thrown against harnesses and bulkheads. But the bomber stayed in one piece. When the smoke finally cleared, what remained of the flying fortress looked less like a bomber and more like a carcass dragged out of the sky. Broken, scorched, riddled with holes, but still miraculously in one piece. A machine that by every law of physics should have slammed into the sea now rested on English soil, trembling under its own weight, but alive. The crew spilled out one by one into the hard English daylight. Some limped, some crawled. All of them coughed up smoke and blood, dazed by the impossible truth that they were still breathing. They had braced for death more than once during the long, burning descent. Yet here they stood, shaken, battered, half collapsed, but alive. John remained in the cockpit long after the others had escaped. He didn't move until the final man was clear, until he was certain no one still needed him. Only then did he reach over and gently pry Rendell's hands from the controls. Hands that, even in death, had clung with desperate strength as if still trying to fly them home. When the medics reached the cockpit, John's right arm was locked rigid, frozen by hours of strain. His face was raw with frostbite, his uniform soaked with blood, much of it not his own. But his eyes were steady. He had kept his promise. But he had done it. He had landed a burning, engine-dead, gearless, flapless bomber with one hand, while fighting a dying man for control, under enemy attack, and he had saved every single crew member aboard. For that impossible act of endurance and courage, John C. Morgan became one of the few pilots in history awarded the Medal of Honor for flying a bomber single-handedly. It was a moment as surreal as the mission itself. Standing in a polished hall thousands of miles from the blood-chilled air of 25,000 feet, the roar of engines replaced by quiet applause, the smell of smoke and burning metal replaced by polished brass and ceremony. The generals who pinned the medal to his uniform had read the after-action reports twice, then a third time, then once more just to be sure. Men who had flown the same brutal missions, who knew engines didn't simply come back, who knew a B-17 without landing gear and flaps didn't glide, it fell. These men, hardened by thousands of sorties, could hardly believe that one pilot had done what the sky itself fought to prevent. And yet the witnesses, the crew whose lives he saved, told the same story every time. Not a single detail wavered. Not a single fact shifted. They'd seen him do it. They'd watched him hold the bomber in his blood-slicked grip, refusing to let go. And when the metal touched his chest, every man in that room understood. Morgan hadn't survived by miracle. He survived by will. But John never called himself a hero, never boasted, never claimed greatness. He would simply say, with the quiet humility of a man who had seen too much, "I wasn't going to let my crew die. That's all." Yet those who had been there remembered more. They remembered the flames licking at the wing, the engines coughing themselves into silence, the smell of burning hydraulic fluid, the sickening drop when the bomber lost power and began falling toward the North Sea. The moment every man aboard realized they were too low to bail out, too damaged to climb, and too far from home to hope. And they remembered looking at John, his arms slick with blood, his face frozen white from oxygen loss, his pilot half dead beside him, while he held on to the controls as if his grip alone could bend physics and will the B-17 back to life. In a way it did, because somehow, inch by inch, breath by breath, he kept the bomber level. Somehow he coaxed it through the flak. Somehow he navigated blind through clouds that hid both England and death. Somehow he landed a machine that should have torn itself apart before it ever touched the ground. History remembers what he did that day, how he held the controls of a dying plane for hours, how he refused to give up when the sky turned against him, how he turned a burning coffin into a runway miracle, how he landed the impossible, and how one man, fighting alone in a shattered cockpit at 25,000 feet, kept 9 others alive when everything said they should have died. Some stories of war are written in strategy, others in sacrifice. But this one was written in fire, blood, in the unbreakable grip of a single pilot who refused to let go. Because in the heart of the Second World War, when the sky became a battlefield and death circled like a hawk, there was a moment when courage sat in a cockpit, bleeding, freezing, half-broken, and still chose to fly. And if you think this was the last impossible thing a forgotten hero ever did, wait until you hear what happened on the next mission.